There was a smear of crimson on the mahogany floor the morning Clara interviewed for the job, and a man in a tailored suit was quietly scrubbing it out with club soda. Lorenzo didn't apologize for the mess. He didn't even look at her. He just dropped a stack of encrypted ledgers onto the desk and told her she had 10 minutes to find a missing $2 million. 7 secretaries had fled this week alone. Clara didn't blink. She just pulled up a chair and started reading. The Rossi Corporation occupied the top 3 floors of a glass and steel monolith in downtown Chicago. From the outside, it was a logistics and shipping empire. From the inside, it was a fortress. You could feel the shift in air pressure the moment the elevator passed the 50th floor. The air grew thinner, colder. Clara Hayes stepped out of the elevator on a Tuesday. She was 26, carrying $30,000 in debt left by a man who had promised her the world, and then pawned her car to buy fentanyl. She didn't have time for fear. Fear was a luxury for people who didn't have final eviction notices taped to their doors. She walked past a girl who was currently sobbing into a cardboard box. The girl couldn't have been older than 22, her mascara running in thick black rivulets down her cheeks. A large man with a flattened nose and a suit that cost more than Clara's life insurance policy was gently but firmly steering the crying girl towards the down elevator. "I just brought him the wrong coffee," the girl hiccuped, clutching a stapler as if it were a life raft. "It was just a latte. I didn't know." The large man sighed. "I told you, kid. Black. No sugar. You brought milk into that room. You're lucky you're just fired." Clara watched them go. She adjusted her grip on her cheap faux leather briefcase and walked to the receptionist's desk. The receptionist looked at her with a mixture of pity and exhaustion. "You the 9 o'clock?" the receptionist asked, not bothering to look at a schedule. "Yes, Clara Hayes. Good luck. He's in a mood. The last one lasted 45 minutes. The record is 3 days." Lorenzo Rossi's office sat at the end of a long, wide corridor devoid of artwork. No inspirational quotes, no abstract paintings to soften the sterile environment. Just heavy oak doors at the very end, flanked by 2 men who looked like they read balance sheets for fun and broke kneecaps for exercise. They patted Clara down, not a polite, cursory pat. A thorough, invasive search that left her keenly aware of how out of her depth she was. She didn't flinch. She just let them finish, picked up her briefcase and walked in. Lorenzo stood with his back to the door, staring out at the grey sprawl of the city. He was tall, broad-shouldered. He wore a charcoal suit that moved with him effortlessly, like a second skin. He didn't turn around when the heavy oak door clicked shut behind her. "You're late," he said. His voice was a low baritone. It didn't boom, it didn't echo, it just commanded the space. It was the kind of voice that didn't need to shout to be heard over a gunshot. "Your security detail took 72 seconds to clear me," Clara said. Her voice was flat, neutral. She didn't offer an apology. Apologies were a sign of weakness in rooms like this. Lorenzo turned. He had a face carved from granite and exhaustion. Dark circles bruised the skin under his eyes. His jaw was clenched tight enough to crack teeth. He looked at her. He really looked at her. Most men saw Clara and didn't see much. She wore muted colors: beige, navy, slate. She pulled her brown hair into a tight, severe bun. She wore no makeup. She had spent the last 5 years perfecting the art of being invisible. "Sit," he commanded. Clara sat. "The last girl cried when I raised my voice," Lorenzo said, walking to his desk. It was a massive slab of dark wood, completely bare except for a laptop, a landline phone, and a crystal ashtray. "The one before her tried to sleep with me to secure the job. The one before that asked too many questions about why our shipping crates out of Palermo weighed 300 pounds more than the manifest stated. He leaned forward, resting his palms on the desk. I fire people. I fire them often. I don't tolerate mistakes. I don't repeat myself. And I don't care about your personal life. If you need a mental health day, quit. If you want to chat about the weather, go work at a bakery. You are here to manage my schedule, filter my calls, and process documents that you will promptly forget you ever read. Do you understand? Yes, Clara said. Lorenzo narrowed his eyes. You don't ask what the pay is. The agency said it was double the market rate. I assume there's a reason for that. I assume the reason is sitting in front of me. A flicker of something crossed Lorenzo's face. Annoyance? Amusement? It was gone before Clara could categorize it. He pushed a stack of files across the desk. There is a discrepancy in these ledgers. $2 million is unaccounted for. You have 10 minutes to find it. If you can't, use the door you came in. Clara pulled the files toward her. She opened the first one. Numbers, columns, hundreds of pages of them. She didn't look up. She didn't sigh. She just started tracing the lines with her index finger, her eyes flicking back and forth. The room was utterly silent, save for the soft ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner and the occasional scrape of paper. Lorenzo watched her. He expected the panic to set in at the 3-minute mark. That was usually when they realized it was a trap. By minute 5, they usually started sweating. By minute 8, they were making excuses. Clara did none of that. At exactly 9 minutes and 40 seconds, she closed the last folder. She slid it back across the desk. Well, Lorenzo asked, crossing his arms. The money isn't missing, Clara said quietly. It was moved. On page 42, there's an entry for maintenance on the fleet. It's inflated by exactly 800,000. On page 112, consulting fees to a firm in Malta for 1.2 million. The firm doesn't exist. The routing numbers point back to a holding company. She paused. You didn't lose $2 million. You laundered it. The silence that followed was suffocating. Lorenzo stared at her. His gaze was heavy, assessing. Men had been beaten half to death for noticing less. Clara held his gaze. She didn't challenge him. She just stated a fact. Your coffee, Lorenzo said finally, his voice dropping a fraction of an octave, will be black. If you put sugar in it, I will throw it at the wall. Be here at 6 a.m. tomorrow. Clara stood up. Yes, Mr. Rossi. She turned and walked out. She didn't look back. Her hands were shaking, but she waited until she was in the elevator, dropping 50 floors back to reality before she allowed herself to breathe. Survival in Lorenzo Rossi's world required a specific set of skills. You had to be deaf, blind, and mute, yet simultaneously possess a photographic memory and perfect foresight. Clara lasted her first week, then her second. By the time a month had passed, the men with the flattened noses and bulging jackets stopped betting on what day she would be fired. They started nodding at her when she arrived at 5:45 every morning. They learned her name. She didn't learn theirs. She didn't want to know them. Her routine was punishing. Arrive, make the coffee, exactly 2.5 scoops of the dark roast, filtered water, no sugar, no cream. Place it on the right side of his desk, precisely 3 inches from the edge. Sort the mail. The white envelopes went into the shredder immediately. The manila envelopes went into the safe. The encrypted emails were printed, placed in a leather folder, and handed to Lorenzo when he walked in at 6:30. He rarely spoke to her. When he did, it was in clipped directives. Get me the Palermo numbers. Cancel my afternoon. Tell them if the shipment is late again, I'll burn the warehouse down. Clara relayed the messages verbatim. She didn't soften his threats. She didn't offer pleasantries to the terrified men on the other end of the line. She was a conduit, a highly efficient, invisible conduit. Lorenzo began to notice the quiet. He was a man accustomed to noise, the noise of sycophants clamoring for his favor, the noise of enemies plotting his downfall, the noise of his own violent, restless mind. People around him were always making noise. They breathed too loudly, they shifted in their chairs, they coughed, they tried to fill the silence with useless chatter, because silence made them uncomfortable. Clara owned the silence. She existed within it. She would stand in his office for 20 minutes, waiting for him to finish a phone call so she could hand him a document, and he would genuinely forget she was there. She didn't tap her foot. She didn't sigh. She just waited. It began to unnerve him, and Lorenzo Rossi did not like being unnerved. He started testing her. Small things at first. He deliberately dropped a stack of confidential photos on the floor. Grainy surveillance shots of a rival boss meeting with an undercover Fed. Clara knelt, picked them up, squared the edges, and placed them face down on his desk. She didn't linger on the images. Her heart rate didn't elevate. He left his schedule completely blank for 3 days and refused to tell her where he was going. She tracked his movements through credit card pings, flight manifests, and whispered rumors from the security detail, managing his entire enterprise seamlessly while he was incommunicado. When he returned, there was no backlog. Everything was handled. The final test came on a rainy Thursday in November. Clara walked into his office to deliver his afternoon espresso. The room smelled of ozone and expensive cologne. Lorenzo was standing by the window, watching the rain lash against the glass. On the center of his desk, lying casually next to his laptop, was a Glock 19. It wasn't holstered. The safety was off. A chambered round was visible in the loaded indicator. Clara paused. She looked at the gun. She looked at Lorenzo's back. Most people would have backed out of the room. Some would have asked if everything was all right. A few might have panicked. Clara stepped forward. The gun was exactly where she needed to place the espresso cup. She didn't hesitate. She reached out with her free hand, picked up the Glock by the textured grip, and smoothly slid it 6 inches to the left. She set the espresso down in its designated spot, perfectly aligned with the edge of the desk. "You're 3 o'clock with the union reps called to confirm," Clara said, her voice a steady, monotonous hum. "I pushed them to 4. You need to review the quarterly losses from the South Side operation first." Lorenzo turned around slowly. He looked at the gun, he looked at the espresso, he looked at Clara. "You moved my weapon," he said. It wasn't a question. "It was in the way of the coffee," Clara replied. Lorenzo stepped closer. He towered over her, his physical presence a heavy, suffocating weight. He leaned down, invading her personal space. Clara didn't lean back. She held her ground, her eyes fixed on his chin. Looking him in the eye was a challenge. Looking at the floor was submission. The chin was a safe, neutral territory. "Do you know how to use that?" he asked, nodding toward the gun. "No," Clara lied. She knew exactly how to use it. Her father had been a cop before he drank himself to death, and he had taught her how to shoot before she was old enough to drive. "You aren't afraid of it?" "It's an inanimate object, Mr. Rossi. It only does what the hand holding it tells it to do." Lorenzo stared at her. The cynical armor he wore, the defensive walls built from years of betrayal and blood, seemed to catch on her sheer, unyielding neutrality. He realized in that moment that Clara wasn't just quiet, she was dead inside. She had survived something that had burned the panic out of her nerves. "Get me the quarterly reports," he muttered, stepping back. "Already on your desk, under the secondary file." She turned and left. Lorenzo picked up his espresso. It was perfectly hot. He looked at the closed door. a strange, unfamiliar knot forming in his chest. He had hired a machine, or so he thought. The illusion of a legitimate corporate office shattered on a Tuesday in mid-December. Clara was at her desk, typing up minutes from a board meeting that had actually been a territorial negotiation. The outer doors to the executive suite burst open. The receptionist outside didn't even have time to press the panic button. 4 men walked in. They weren't Lorenzo's men. They wore cheap suits and carried themselves with a reckless, frantic energy. Clara recognized the type immediately. Low-level muscle, ambitious, stupid, and desperate. They belonged to the Moretti crew, a rival faction that had been bleeding territory to Lorenzo for 6 months. "Where is he?" the lead man barked, a thick scar bisecting his left eyebrow. He had a revolver gripped loosely in his right hand. Clara stopped typing. She didn't reach for the phone. She didn't scream. She slowly rested her hands on her lap. "Mr. Rossi is in a meeting," Clara said smoothly. "Do you have an appointment?" The man laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. He stalked toward her desk, aiming the gun at her chest. "Cute, get up, open the door." At that exact moment, the heavy oak doors of Lorenzo's office swung inward. Lorenzo stood in the doorway, his suit jacket off, his sleeves rolled up to the elbows, revealing forearms corded with muscle and ink. Behind him, on the floor of his office, a man was bleeding heavily from a broken nose. Lorenzo took in the scene in a fraction of a second. The 4 men, the drawn gun, Clara sitting motionless. The air in the room snapped tight, like a wire pulled to the breaking point. "Put the gun down, Tommy," Lorenzo said. His voice was terrifyingly calm. It was the voice of a man who was calculating the trajectory of a bullet and the time it would take to break a windpipe. "We want our cut, Lorenzo," the man, Tommy, snarled, his hand shaking slightly. 50% of the docks. You don't just take what's ours." "I take whatever I want," Lorenzo replied. He took a slow step forward. "But if you don't lower that weapon away from my secretary in the next 3 seconds, I'm going to take your eyes." Tommy swallowed hard. He swung the gun, aiming it at Lorenzo. That was his first mistake. His second was hesitating. In the span of 2 breaths, the room exploded into violence. Lorenzo lunged. He moved with a brutal, predatory speed that defied his size. He grabbed Tommy's wrist, twisting it upward with a sickening crack. The gun went off, the bullet burying itself in the acoustic ceiling tiles. Plaster rained down on Clara's desk. The other 3 men rushed in. The sound of flesh hitting bone echoed through the suite. Grunts, shouts, the heavy thud of bodies hitting the floor. It wasn't a movie fight. It was ugly, desperate, close-quarters combat. Lorenzo fought like a man possessed, using elbows, knees, and whatever was at hand. He smashed one man's face into the edge of Clara's desk. He threw another through the glass partition of the waiting area. Clara didn't duck under her desk. She slowly, methodically, reached over and hit the silent alarm under the lip of her keyboard. Then she pulled open her bottom drawer, took out her purse, and waited. It was over in less than 2 minutes. The 4 Moretti men were on the floor. 2 were unconscious. 1 was groaning, clutching a shattered knee. Tommy was curled in a fetal position, nursing a broken arm and a jaw that hung at a wrong angle. Lorenzo stood in the center of the carnage. He was breathing heavily. His knuckles were raw and split. Blood, someone else's, was splattered across his white dress shirt. He looked down at the men, his eyes burning with a dark, violent rage. Then he looked at Clara. He expected her to be cowering. He expected hysteria. He expected her to quit on the spot. Clara was holding a damp cloth and a roll of heavy-duty paper towels. "Your security team will be up in the elevator in approximately 40 seconds, Clara said. Her voice didn't waver. It cut through the adrenaline-soaked air like a scalpel. She walked out from behind her desk, stepping over the man groaning on the floor, her sensible low heels avoiding the pools of blood. She walked right up to Lorenzo. He tensed, his body still humming with the need to destroy. He towered over her, his chest heaving, his eyes wild. Clara didn't flinch. She reached out and took his right hand. Lorenzo froze. Her touch was cool, entirely devoid of fear. She examined his split knuckles. "You're bleeding on the rug, Mr. Rossi. It's antique." Lorenzo stared down at her, dumbfounded. The sheer absurdity of the statement knocked the wind out of his rage. The violent fog in his brain parted, leaving him staring at the top of her head as she gently dabbed his knuckles with the damp cloth. "They had a gun on you," Lorenzo rasped, his voice rough. He was holding it improperly. If he fired, the recoil would have thrown his aim wide left, Clara noted clinically. "Press this to your hand. Keep the pressure steady." She handed him the cloth. The elevator dinged. 5 of Lorenzo's men poured out, weapons drawn, taking in the scene. "Clean this up," Lorenzo barked at them, not taking his eyes off Clara. "Get them out of here. If they bleed in the elevator, make them lick it up." The men scrambled to comply, dragging the groaning Moretti muscle toward the service elevator. Lorenzo remained standing near Clara's desk. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a sharp, throbbing ache in his hand and a deep, unsettling realization. He looked at Clara, who had returned to her chair and was calmly brushing ceiling plaster off her keyboard. "You didn't scream," he said. "Screaming doesn't change outcomes. It just wastes oxygen," Clara replied, bringing up her calendar on the monitor. "I need to call the glazier about the partition and the cleaning crew, the discreet ones." Lorenzo walked and placed both his hands flat on her desk, leaning in close. His face was inches from hers. The smell of copper and sweat radiated off him. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice dropping to a whisper meant only for her. "Normal people don't look at a bloodbath and worry about the dry cleaning." Clara finally looked up. She looked past the intimidation, past the blood, past the aura of power that made men tremble. She looked at him with an exhaustion that mirrored his own. "Normal people," Clara said quietly, "don't survive long enough to need a paycheck. I'll get the glazier on the phone. Go change your shirt, Mr. Rossi. You have a dinner meeting at 8. Lorenzo stood up slowly. He looked at her for a long, heavy moment. The invisible wall she had built, the ghost-like presence she projected, had finally cracked just enough for him to see inside. He didn't see a machine. He saw a survivor. Without another word, he turned and walked into his office, the heavy oak doors closing behind him. For the first time in his life, the silence on the other side didn't feel empty. It felt like a challenge. Lorenzo Rossi did not like mysteries. Mysteries were vulnerabilities. They were loose threads that, if pulled, could unravel an entire organization. For 5 weeks, Clara Hayes had been the most efficient secretary he had ever employed. She was also a locked vault. He tasked Leo, his head of intelligence, with breaking the lock. It took Leo 3 days to compile the dossier. He dropped the manila folder on Lorenzo's desk on a Friday afternoon. Clara was out picking up the encrypted ledgers from the downtown safe house. "She's clean, boss," Leo said, his voice gravelly from decades of cheap cigars. "Boring even. Grew up in Southside. Father was a beat cop, drank his liver into gravel. Mother checked out when she was 12. Good grades, community college. Then she met a guy." Lorenzo didn't look up from the folder. He opened it. There was a grainy DMV photo of Clara. She looked younger, softer, but the exhaustion was already settling around her eyes. "Who is he?" Lorenzo asked. "Kevin Miller, mid-level grifter. Started with credit card fraud. graduated to selling imported fentanyl. He used her name to secure a series of loans, pawned her vehicle, maxed out lines of credit, and then vanished when the feds started sniffing around. Leo tapped a sheet of paper, left her holding the bag. $31,452. Debt collectors have been hounding her for 2 years. That's why she doesn't flinch when Muscle walks in the door. She's used to being threatened over money she doesn't have. Lorenzo stared at the number. $31,000. He spent that on tailored suits in a month. To her, it was an anvil tied around her neck, dragging her down into the dark. It was the reason she wore shoes with scuffed soles. It was the reason she ate a single, bruised apple for lunch every day at her desk. "Find the debt holders," Lorenzo said, his voice flat. "Buy it, zero it out, and find Kevin Miller. Break both of his legs, take his teeth, and leave him tied to the fence outside the DEA field office." Leo nodded, recognizing the cold finality in his boss's tone. "Consider it done." When Clara returned an hour later, she placed the ledgers on his desk, exactly where they belonged. She poured his espresso. She turned to leave. She didn't know yet, but she found out on Monday. Clara walked into his office at exactly 6 a.m. Lorenzo was already there, reviewing the European shipping schedules. He expected her to say nothing, or perhaps offer a quiet, bewildered thank you. He expected relief. He did not expect the icy, simmering rage radiating from her. She didn't pour the coffee. She walked to his desk and placed a cashier's check on the polished oak. It was made out to him for $800. Lorenzo looked at it, then up at her. "What is this?" "My entire savings," Clara said. Her voice wasn't flat today. It was vibrating. "It's the first installment. I'll pay you $2,000 a month from my salary until the $31,000 is cleared, plus whatever interest rate you deem appropriate." Lorenzo frowned, leaning back in his leather chair. "The debt is gone, Clara. It's handled." "You bought it," she corrected, her hands gripping the edge of his desk. Her knuckles were white. "You paid off the collection agencies, which means I don't owe them anymore. I owe you." "You don't owe me anything. It was a bonus for handling the Moretti incident." "I don't want your charity," Clara snapped. It was the loudest she had ever spoken in his presence. The sound echoed off the glass walls. "I didn't ask for a savior. I survived the last 2 years because I own my mistakes. I own my debt. I drag it with me, but it belongs to me. You took that. You made me an asset on your balance sheet." Lorenzo stood up. He was a foot taller than her, a massive wall of muscle and menace, but Clara didn't back down an inch. She tilted her chin up, glaring at him with a ferocity that caught him completely off guard. "I removed a distraction," Lorenzo growled, leaning over the desk. "You are my secretary. I need you focused on my business, not dodging phone calls from bottom-feeding collection agents." "You bought me," she fired back, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Kevin sold my name, and you bought my peace of mind. Both of you decided you knew what was best for my life without asking me. Do not ever look into my past again, Mr. Rossi. If you want to own people, stick to your soldiers. I work here. I am not yours." She turned on her heel and marched out of the office, slamming the heavy oak doors behind her. Lorenzo stood in the silence, staring at the closed doors. His chest was tight. He was a man who commanded fear, loyalty, and absolute obedience. He had just handed this woman a new life on a silver platter, and she had effectively thrown it back in his face. He looked down at the $800 cashier's check. He didn't shred it. He opened his top drawer and placed it inside, right next to his spare loaded magazine. She wasn't just a survivor. She was iron. And for the first time in 10 years, Lorenzo Rossi realized He was entirely out of his depth. The criminal underworld does not operate on a standard schedule. It thrives in the hours when legitimate society is asleep, relying on the dark to hide its transactions and its sins. It was 2:14 a.m. on a Wednesday. The executive suite was a tomb of glass and shadows. The city lights below cast long, skeletal reflections across the floors. Clara was at her desk, the harsh glow of her dual monitors illuminating her tired face. She was manually reconciling a corrupted offshore account ledger. She preferred working the late shifts now. It paid time and a half, and it kept her away from her empty, drafty apartment. The private elevator pinged. Clara's hands paused on the keyboard. Very few people had the keycard access for the private lift. She slid her right hand smoothly into her top drawer, resting her fingers against the cold steel of the heavy brass letter opener she kept there. It wasn't a gun, but she knew where the carotid artery was. The doors slid open. Lorenzo stumbled out. He didn't walk with his usual predatory grace. He swayed, leaning heavily against the frosted glass partition. He was missing his suit jacket. His white shirt was untucked, soaked in rain and something darker, heavier. Clara stood up immediately. She didn't gasp. She walked briskly around her desk. "Mr. Rossi," he looked up at her. His eyes were bloodshot, pupils blown wide. There was a jagged gash across his left cheekbone, weeping sluggishly. But it wasn't the physical damage that stopped Clara in her tracks. It was the look on his face, the absolute, hollowed-out devastation. "Frankie," Lorenzo rasped, his voice sounding like ground glass. Frankie was his underboss, his oldest friend, the man who had stood beside him when Lorenzo took over the family at 24. "Frankie sold the dock routes to the Morettis," Lorenzo said. He pushed off the glass wall and staggered toward his office. "He set the ambush. 3 of my men are dead in an alley off Halstead." Clara followed him into the dark office. He didn't turn on the lights. He went straight for the wet bar, grabbing a bottle of scotch with shaking hands. He bypassed the glass entirely, raising the bottle to his mouth and drinking heavily. Clara locked the heavy oak doors behind them. She walked to his private bathroom, soaked a thick hand towel in warm water, and returned to the office. Lorenzo was slumped in his leather chair, the bottle dangling loosely from his grip, staring blindly out at the city lights. "He was the godfather to my sister's kid," Lorenzo whispered into the dark. Clara approached him slowly. She didn't offer platitudes. Platitudes were insults disguised as comfort. She took the bottle from his hand and set it on the desk. Then she gently pressed the warm, damp towel to the gash on his cheek. Lorenzo flinched at the contact, his muscles tensing, ready to fight. "Hold still," Clara said quietly. He froze. He let her clean the blood from his face. Her touch was methodical, clinical, yet it was the only anchoring force in the room. The smell of cheap soap and old paper clung to her, cutting through the heavy stench of copper, gunpowder and scotch that he had brought in with him. "Did you kill him?" Clara asked. Her tone was conversational, as if asking about a delayed shipment. Lorenzo let out a breath that was half a laugh, half a sob. "I put 2 rounds in his chest, watched him choke on his own blood on the asphalt. He looked surprised. Even after setting me up, he looked surprised that I actually pulled the trigger." "People always think they are the exception to the rule," Clara murmured, wiping away a smear of crimson near his jawline. Lorenzo reached up. He grabbed her wrist. His grip was tight, his large hand completely encircling her narrow wrist. Clara went perfectly still. She didn't pull away. She looked down at him. In the dim light of the city skyline, the impenetrable armor of the Mafia Don was entirely stripped away. He was just a man a tired, bleeding, betrayed man who was drowning in the life he had built. "Why are you here, Clara?" he asked, his voice low, intense. "You know what I am. You know what I do. You saw the blood today. You know where the money comes from. You're smart enough to work for a legitimate firm. You could leave. Why do you stay in the dark with monsters?" Clara looked at his hand, holding her wrist, then met his gaze. "Because legitimate firms lie," Clara said simply. "They wear nice suits and smile while they lay off thousands of people to bump up their stock prices. They poison rivers and hire lawyers to hide it. The man who ruined my life wore a Patagonia vest and talked about mindfulness while he was stealing from my bank account." She gently pulled her wrist from his grasp. He let her go, his fingers lingering for a fraction of a second against her skin. "The world is ugly everywhere, Lorenzo," she said, using his first name for the very first time. It felt strange on her tongue, heavy and dangerous. "At least down here in the dark, the monsters admit what they are. You don't pretend to be a saint. I know exactly where I stand with you." Lorenzo stared at her. The silence stretched, thick and charged. The air between them shifted, the professional boundary dissolving into something volatile. He reached out again, not grabbing her wrist this time, but lightly tracing the line of her knuckles with his thumb. "You stand right next to me," he said quietly. Clara stepped back, picking up the bloodied towel. "You need a doctor to stitch that cheek or it's going to scar. I'll call Dr. Evans." She retreated to the door, rebuilding the invisible wall brick by brick. But as she turned the handle, she knew the foundation was cracked. He had shown her his throat, and she hadn't cut it. In his world, that was a blood oath. The danger of becoming visible in a world of predators is that you suddenly become prey. For months, Clara had been a ghost, but ghosts don't pay off $30,000 debts in cash. Ghosts don't stand in the inner sanctum while the boss bleeds. Word had seeped out. The Moretti family, reeling from the loss of the dock routes and desperate for leverage against a man who seemingly had no weaknesses, found the one anomaly in Lorenzo Rossi's life. His secretary. It was a Tuesday evening. November rain was turning to sleet, slicking the pavement in a treacherous sheen of ice. Clara walked out of the subway station, wrapping her cheap wool coat tighter around her body. Her apartment was 4 blocks away, in a neighborhood where the streetlights had been shot out and never replaced. She felt them before she saw them. It was a subtle shift in the rhythm of the street. Footsteps behind her that matched her pace perfectly. A black sedan idling a little too long at the intersection ahead. Clara didn't speed up. Panic was blood in the water. She kept her pace steady, her eyes scanning the shadows. She turned down an alley that cut through to her street. It was a calculated risk. It was a bottleneck, but it was also dark enough to hide. 2 men stepped out from behind a dumpster, blocking her path. They wore thick leather jackets. One had a crowbar resting casually against his leg. The other had a hand shoved deep into his pocket, the unmistakable bulge of a firearm pointing directly at her. Clara stopped. She didn't drop her purse. She didn't scream. She calculated the distance, 10 feet, too far for the pepper spray on her keychain. "Clara Hayes," the man with the crowbar said, smiling. He had a gold tooth that caught the faint light from the street. "You're a hard woman to track down. Rossi keeps you wrapped up tight." "I have $80 in my purse and a MetroCard," Clara said, her voice deadpan. "Take it and go," the man laughed. "We don't want your cash, sweetheart. We want a ride. We're going to put you in that car over there, and we're going to call your boss. We want to see how much of our territory he's willing to give back to keep his favorite paper pusher breathing." "You're making a mistake," Clara said. "I don't think so." The man stepped forward. "Not about the kidnapping," Clara clarified, her heart hammering against her ribs, though her face remained a mask of stone. You're making a mistake about my value. Lorenzo Rossi doesn't negotiate for hostages. He considers getting caught a sign of incompetence. If you call him, he won't give you territory. He'll just hire a new secretary tomorrow morning. The man with the gun frowned, glancing at his partner. The hesitation was brief, but it was there. She's bluffing. Grab her, the gun-toting man snapped. Before the man with the crowbar could take another step, the roar of a high-performance engine shattered the quiet of the alley. A sleek, matte-black SUV tore around the corner, jumping the curb and barreling directly down the narrow alleyway. The high beams blinded them. The two men scattered, diving into the trash and slush to avoid being crushed against the brick walls. The SUV slammed on the brakes, stopping inches from Clara. The driver's side door kicked open. Lorenzo stepped out into the sleet. He wasn't wearing a suit. He wore a dark, tactical jacket, his face and mask of absolute, unhinged fury. He didn't even draw his weapon. He walked straight toward the man with the crowbar, grabbing him by the throat and slamming him into the brick wall with a sickening crunch. The man dropped the crowbar, gasping for air. The second man scrambled to his feet, pulling his gun. "Lorenzo!" Clara shouted. A gunshot rang out, not from the Moretti man, from the shadows of the street corner. The man with the gun screamed, dropping his weapon as his shoulder shattered. Two of Lorenzo's men stepped out of the darkness, rifles raised. They had been tailing her. Lorenzo didn't look at the bleeding man. He kept his grip on the first man's throat, lifting him an inch off the ground. "Tell Moretti," Lorenzo hissed, his voice echoing like thunder in the narrow space. "If he ever looks at her shadow again, I will burn his house to the ground with his children inside." He threw the man into the slush. "Run!" The men scrambled away, dragging their wounded partner, leaving a trail of blood in the snow. Lorenzo turned. He walked toward Clara. He was breathing heavily, the adrenaline radiating off him in waves. He looked her up and down, checking for injuries. When he saw she was unharmed, the fury in his eyes didn't fade. It morphed into something entirely different. Desperation. He didn't speak. He reached out, grabbed her by the lapels of her coat, and pulled her hard against his chest. Clara gasped, the impact jarring her. He wrapped his arms around her, burying his face in her wet hair. His heart was pounding like a jackhammer against her cheek. It was a suffocating, possessive embrace. "You didn't have security," Lorenzo breathed against her ear, his voice ragged. "I told Leo to put a detail on you, and you ditched them at the subway. I don't need babysitters," Clara managed to say, her voice muffled against his jacket. Her hands, entirely of their own volition, slowly came up to grip his waist. Lorenzo pulled back just enough to look at her face. The sleet was freezing on her eyelashes. "You are a target now," he said fiercely. "They know you matter to me. They know you are the only thing in this city I can't afford to lose." Clara stared at him, the reality of his words sinking in like a stone in a frozen lake. The invisible wall she had spent years building was gone, completely obliterated by the violent, terrifying gravity of the man standing in front of her. "Get in the car," Lorenzo ordered, his tone leaving no room for debate. "You aren't going back to that apartment. Not tonight. Not ever." Clara looked at the open door of the SUV. She looked at her dark, empty street. For the first time in her life, she didn't fight for her independence. She stepped into the warmth of the car, surrendering to the pull of the dark. Lorenzo's penthouse occupied the entire top floor of a high-rise in the Gold Coast. It was a fortress suspended in the clouds, accessible only by a private elevator that required biometric clearance. Inside, it was a sprawling expanse of cold marble, floor-to-ceiling glass, and minimalist furniture that looked too expensive to actually sit on. It was a home designed by someone who never slept. Clara woke up on a Wednesday morning in a guest bedroom the size of her entire apartment. The sheets were high thread count Egyptian cotton, heavy and suffocating. On the end of the bed sat a stack of clothes with the tags still attached. Silk blouses, tailored wool trousers, cashmere sweaters, all in her muted colour palette: beige, navy, slate. She stared at the clothes. They were an apology and a collar, all wrapped into one. She didn't put them on. She dug through the duffel bag one of Lorenzo's men had hastily packed from her apartment the night before. She found her own slightly faded grey skirt and a white button-down shirt that had been washed too many times. She dressed, pinned her hair into its severe bun, and walked out of the room. The penthouse was silent. 2 men in dark suits stood by the front door. They didn't speak, but their eyes tracked her every movement. She found Lorenzo in the kitchen. He was standing by a massive marble island, a tablet in one hand and a cup of black coffee in the other. He wore dark jeans and a Henley that stretched tight across his shoulders. He looked up when she walked in. His eyes dropped to her faded clothes. He didn't comment on the discarded silk. "Leo is bringing up the files from the office," Lorenzo said, his voice gravelly with fatigue. "You'll work from here. I've set up a secure terminal in the study. You don't leave the building." Clara walked to the coffee maker. It was a complex, stainless steel monstrosity. She ignored it, found a mug in the cabinet, and poured herself a glass of tap water. "I have a dentist appointment on Friday," Clara said, leaning against the counter. Lorenzo frowned. "Cancel it. The streets aren't safe. Moretti is panicking. When animals panic, they bite blindly." "I waited 3 months for this appointment. It's a root canal, Lorenzo. I'm not cancelling it." He set the tablet down. The sharp crack of plastic against marble echoed in the cavernous room. "You were almost taken off the street 12 hours ago. You are not walking out the front door so you can get a tooth drilled. Then send an armed guard to the dentist with me," Clara replied, her voice remaining perfectly level. "Or send 3. I don't care. But I'm not trading one prison for another. I am not a hostage, and I am not your kept woman. I am your employee." Lorenzo closed the distance between them. He moved with that same terrifying speed, stopping just inches from her. He smelled like fresh espresso and the metallic tang of adrenaline that never quite washed off him. "You are more than an employee, and we both know it," he said softly. The danger in his voice edged with something raw. "They know it too. If Moretti gets his hands on you, he won't just kill you. He will take his time. He will use you to break me." Clara looked up at him. She saw the exhaustion etched into his features, the heavy burden of keeping a violent empire afloat. She reached out, her fingers lightly brushing the edge of the bandage on his cheek. "Then let's break him first," she said. Lorenzo's eyes widened slightly. "What? Moretti is bleeding territory. You said it yourself. He's panicking," Clara stated, dropping her hand. "Panic means sloppy accounting. Panic means broken supply chains. You've been fighting him in the streets with bullets and baseball bats. That's inefficient. It creates noise. It brings the police." She walked past him, heading towards the hallway that led to the study. "Where are you going?" Lorenzo asked, turning to watch her. "To the secure terminal. Bring me his last 6 months of known imports. Customs declarations, trucking manifests, shell company tax filings, everything Leo has." Clara stopped and looked back over her shoulder. "You don't need to burn his house down, Lorenzo. I can bankrupt him by Tuesday." A slow, dark smile spread across Lorenzo's face. It was a terrifying expression, completely devoid of warmth, yet entirely focused on her. For the first time, he wasn't looking at her like a vulnerability. He was looking at her like a weapon. For 4 days, the study became a war room. Clara barely slept. She lived on black tea and the sterile, cold air of the penthouse AC. The mahogany desk was buried under mountains of paper. Lorenzo sat across from her, fielding calls, managing the street-level fallout, while Clara dissected the financial anatomy of the Moretti crime family. It was entirely unglamorous. It was not the mob wars depicted in cinema. It was tax identification numbers, misspelled cargo manifests, and offshore routing codes. On Saturday night, the rain returned, battering the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city lights blurred into streaks of neon. Clara rubbed her eyes, leaning back in the heavy leather chair. Her vision was swimming. "Here," Lorenzo said. He placed a plate on top of a stack of shipping invoices. It was a grilled cheese sandwich, slightly burned on one edge, and a bowl of tomato soup. Clara looked at the plate, then at Lorenzo. He was sitting on the edge of the desk. He had rolled up his sleeves, revealing a jagged, faded scar that ran from his wrist to his elbow. "You cooked?" Clara asked, her voice raspy. "I assembled," Lorenzo corrected. "Eat. You've been staring at that ledger for 9 hours. Clara picked up a half of the sandwich. It was oily, salty, and perfect. They ate in silence for a few minutes, the only sound the heavy rain against the glass. "I found it," Clara said quietly, wiping her mouth with a paper napkin. Lorenzo stopped mid-bite. He set his soup down. "Show me." Clara spun the monitor around. "Moretti isn't moving his weapons through the docks anymore. Your men shut that down. He's moving them through a commercial textiles front, a company called Azure Linens." She pointed to a series of highlighted cells on a spreadsheet. "But he's not paying his customs inspector in cash. He's paying him through a shell corporation that holds the mortgage on the inspector's house in the suburbs. The payments are categorized as structural consulting." Lorenzo leaned in, his shoulder brushing against hers. He stared at the screen, absorbing the data. "If that shell company defaults on its state tax franchise fees," Clara continued, her voice taking on a clinical, detached rhythm, "the state seizes the assets, including the mortgage. The customs inspector loses his house. He's 3 days away from the deadline because Moretti's accounts are frozen from your street war. Moretti doesn't have the liquidity to pay the franchise fee." Lorenzo looked at her. "How much is the fee?" $42,000. "So we pay it?" Lorenzo asked, a frown creasing his forehead. "No, we buy the debt," Clara said, turning her head to meet his gaze. They were inches apart. "We buy the shell company through a proxy. We hold the inspector's mortgage. We don't just stop Moretti's shipment. We own the man clearing the shipments. The next time Azure Linens brings in a crate, the inspector flags it for federal review. The ATF seizes the shipment. Moretti loses $3 million in unregistered firearms, and he takes the federal charge." Lorenzo was silent. He looked from the monitor to Clara's face. The harsh blue light of the screen illuminated the dark circles under her eyes, the severe line of her jaw. She was completely composed. She had just engineered the destruction of a man's life, the decapitation of a rival empire, with the same emotional detachment she used to order office supplies. He reached out and closed the laptop. The room plunged into the dim, ambient light of the city. "You are terrifying," Lorenzo whispered. "I'm efficient," Clara corrected. Lorenzo reached up, his rough fingers pulling the pins from her bun. Her brown hair fell around her shoulders in a heavy, messy wave. Clara didn't pull away. She let him strip away the severe armor she wore. He stepped between her knees, crowding her into the leather chair. His hands moved to her jaw, tilting her face up. "Why are you doing this, Clara?" he asked, his voice a low rumble in his chest. "You could have just hid behind me. You could have let my soldiers handle it. Instead, you're tying your hands to mine. If this goes wrong, the feds won't care that you were just the secretary. You'll go down with me." Clara looked deep into his dark, violent eyes. She saw the monster there, sleeping just beneath the surface. But she also saw the man who had scrubbed his own flaws, the man who had bought her debt to set her free, the man who had burned an alleyway to the ground to keep her breathing. "I told you," Clara said, her voice steady. "I own my debts. You saved my life in that alley. I am balancing the ledger." "I don't want your gratitude," Lorenzo growled, his grip on her jaw tightening slightly. "I don't want a balanced ledger." "Then what do you want?" Lorenzo didn't answer with words. He leaned down and kissed her. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a collision. It was years of exhaustion, violence, and isolation crashing into a wall of unyielding resilience. Clara gasped against his mouth, her hands gripping the front of his shirt. He tasted like salt, scotch, and desperation. He kissed her like a man starving, his hands dropping to her waist to pull her flush against him. Clara kissed him back with equal ferocity. There was no romance in it, no soft, whispered promises. It was an acknowledgement of the dark. It was two survivors, realizing that the only thing in the world that made sense was the person standing in front of them. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing heavily. Lorenzo rested his forehead against hers. "Make the purchase," Lorenzo breathed. "Buy the shell company. End him." Clara nodded once. She reached around him, opened the laptop, and hit execute on the wire transfer. The fallout was swift, silent, and absolute. On Tuesday morning, the ATF raided the Azure Linens warehouse in Cicero. They found 300 unregistered semi-automatic rifles buried under crates of cheap hotel towels. The customs inspector, suddenly realizing his pension and his home were currently owned by a holding company registered to a Lorenzo Rossi proxy, flipped immediately. He handed the feds the entire paper trail. By Wednesday afternoon, federal agents were kicking down the door of the Moretti compound. Tommy, the muscle with the scar, was arrested trying to flee through a storm drain. Moretti himself was taken out in handcuffs, screaming obscenities at the news cameras. No shots were fired by Lorenzo's men. No blood was spilled on the streets. The Rossi family didn't lose a single soldier. It was a bloodless massacre. A week later, the executive suite on the 50th floor was back to normal. The glass partition had been replaced. The antique rug had been deep cleaned. The grandfather clock ticked rhythmically in the corner. Clara walked out of the private elevator at exactly 5:45 in the morning. The security men with the flattened noses didn't just nod at her today. They stood up straighter. They averted their eyes. Word had trickled down through the ranks. They didn't know the exact details of the Moretti takedown, but they knew who had orchestrated it. The men in the tailored suits no longer looked at her as a civilian. They looked at her with a profound, quiet dread. She walked to the kitchenette. She took out the dark roast, 2.5 scoops, filtered water. She walked into Lorenzo's office. He was already at his desk, staring out at the sunrise bleeding over Lake Michigan. He wore a crisp navy suit, the bruised skin under his eyes finally beginning to fade. Clara set the espresso on the right side of his desk, precisely 3 inches from the edge. Lorenzo turned away from the window. He looked at the coffee, then at her. "The offshore accounts are fully reconciled," Clara said, her voice dropping back into its familiar, neutral hum. "The union reps are scheduled for 2 o'clock, and you have a dinner at 8 with the alderman." Lorenzo didn't reach for the coffee. He reached into his top drawer. He pulled out a piece of paper and slid it across the desk. Clara looked down. It was the cashier's check, the $800 she had tried to give him to pay off her debt. "I don't hold your debt, Clara," Lorenzo said, his voice quiet but commanding the room. "And you don't hold mine. The ledger is clear." Clara stared at the check. She slowly reached out, picked it up, and tore it neatly in half, then in quarters. She dropped the pieces into the leather wastebasket beside the desk. "Good," Clara said. She turned to leave, heading back to her desk in the outer office. "Clara," Lorenzo called out. She paused, her hand on the heavy brass handle of the oak door. She looked back at him. Lorenzo picked up the espresso. He took a sip. "The union rep's at 2 o'clock. I want you in the room." Clara's hand stilled. The secretaries never sat in on the sit-downs. The secretaries poured the coffee, shut the door, and put on noise-cancelling headphones to ignore the shouting. "They're going to ask for a 12% increase on the freight loading contracts," Lorenzo continued, setting the cup down. "I want you to explain to them exactly how much their pension fund relies on our shell corporations. I want you to walk them through the math." He wasn't asking her to take notes. He was asking her to negotiate. He was pulling her out of the shadows and placing her directly at his right hand. Clara looked at him. The man who fired a secretary a week because they couldn't handle his coffee was now handing her the keys to the kingdom. He wasn't doing it out of love, though the possessive fire in his eyes burned hotter than ever. He was doing it out of respect. 12% is too high," Clara said, her analytical mind already stripping the problem down to its bolts. "I can cap them at 7.5 if I leverage the tax loopholes in the new Port Authority legislation." Lorenzo smiled. It was a real smile, genuine and dangerous, reserved entirely for her. "Then cap them at 7.5. Tell Leo to bring you the Port Authority files." "I already have them," Clara said. She pulled open the heavy oak door. She walked out to her desk, not the invisible ghost she used to be, but the architect of the empire. She sat down, booted up her dual monitors, and began to type. Through the open doors, Lorenzo watched her. He finally had his quiet, but it wasn't the silence of submission. It was the calm, terrifying silence of a loaded weapon, held steady by a woman who knew exactly where to aim. Did Clara's ruthless efficiency leave you breathless, or did Lorenzo's fierce protective devotion win you over? The line between survival and power is razor thin, and these two just rewrote all the rules. If you loved diving into the dark, dangerous, and deeply human world of the Rossi Empire, hit that like button right now. It really helps the channel grow. Don't forget to share this story with a friend who loves a grounded, gritty mafia romance where the heroine fights back with her brain. Subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss our next gripping audio drama.